I'm a huge advocate of pulling for whatever character you want to play, no matter what other people say, but if there's one character I'd have to recommend to everyone from a progression standpoint, it's definitely going to be Kazuha. His ridiculous support potential is not even locked behind any constellations, and he's already extremely broken at C0. And I swear, even if you don't care for progression, I have never seen or heard from a Kazuha hater in my life. I mean, have any of you guys even seen or read Kazuha slander? Everyone in this goddamn community loves Kazuha, and I'm convinced his haters don't exist. As always, this guide will cover everything you need to know from Kazuha's best artifacts and weapons, to general playstyle and team compositions. Without further ado, let's get this guide rolling. You already know Kazuha is a phenomenal support, but with great power comes great responsibility, aka things you need to understand. By now you should know the basics, like how Kazuha's elemental skill allows him to pull enemies in and plunge attack, or how his passive grants the party elemental damage bonus of the corresponding element he swirls, which scales off elemental mastery. If you really want to master Kazuha, there are two more mechanics and one misconception that you need to understand. First, let's talk about what's known as the elemental absorption priority. This is a general mechanic in Genshin Impact that determines what element things like Sucrose Burst, Venti Burst, or Kazuha Burst can absorb. If there are multiple enemies around with different elements, then your Anemo Burst will prioritize Pyro first, then Hydro, Electro, and Cryo in that order. This order is super important for us to understand because it allows us to control our battles and get the desired element for our Kazuha Burst in certain teams. With the elemental absorption priority in mind, let's talk about the second mechanic, which involves getting a double swirl for overlapping elemental damage buffs. The most common example you probably see in your Twitch, YouTube, and TikTok clips is with Bennett, so let's explain the interaction in that specific situation. The thing with Kazuha is that his elemental absorption on both his skill and burst are not from just the elements on the enemy, but also the elements on himself. In this case, Bennett's burst applies Pyro onto our own characters, allowing Kazuha to swirl a Hydro element on the enemy for Hydro damage bonus, but also guarantee a Pyro absorption with the element priority we just talked about. You might be thinking, okay, that's pretty simple, but actually there's a huge misconception that I want to take a little bit of time to explain here since it's a little confusing to understand and not many people actually know it. The important misconception is that if you get a Pyro absorption on Kazuha's elemental skill, that means you have the Pyro damage bonus buff, right? Wrong. In fact, here in this example, I clearly get the Pyro absorption, but when I check my stats, I only have Hydro damage bonus. Why's that? Well, this has to do with the order of damage. What I mean by this is that when Kazuha plunge attacks, the elemental absorption damage comes out before Kazuha's anemo damage from the base skill. Going back to the example with Xingqiu and Bennett to keep things simple, what's happening here is after we tap our skill, we swirl the Hydro on the enemy and absorb Pyro from Bennett's burst. That much is pretty easy to understand. However, we haven't completely removed the Hydro from the enemy, and on the way back down, the Pyro Infusion damage goes first and reacts with the Hydro for Vaporize damage. This leaves the Anemo damage with no Pyro to actually swirl. And this is precisely why we fail to get Pyro damage bonus and only get Hydro damage bonus in this situation. So now you're probably asking, how do I fix this? Well, under the assumption that most of you guys simply don't know or don't care about the elemental gauge theory, the easiest way to ensure a double swirl with Kazuha's elemental skill is to hold his elemental skill instead of just tapping it. Without getting into the specifics, holding Kazuha's skill instead of tapping will completely remove the elements on the way up, instead of just partially removing the elements. This will cleanse the enemy of elements, allow your plunge attack to correctly apply a new element on the way down, and then immediately swirl for a second elemental damage buff. As for Kazuha's artifacts, they are pretty simple, so one could argue I don't even need this section, but regardless, I'm going to give a few pointers beyond the general infographic to stay consistent with my other videos and also debunk another misconception. The only artifact set that you should ever run on Kazuha is the 4-set Viridescent Veneer, regardless of whether you have him at C0 or C6. This is one of the most broken, if not the most broken artifact sets in the game, and it just makes his support that much better. If you don't have this artifact set ready for Kazuha, farm it immediately. That's all I'm going to say. The only exception to this is if you're under AR 45 and can't farm 5-star Viridescent pieces yet. In that case, you can just run whatever the game gives you that has elemental mastery. The most recommended option for beginners is the 4-set Instructor. As for artifact stats, things vary depending on whether or not you have Kazuha's C6. If you're anywhere from C0 to C5, your best artifacts will undoubtedly be the triple EM in the Sands, Goblet, and Circlet. If you're running an Elemental Mastery weapon, you can also replace the Sands with Energy Recharge should you need the extra energy generation. The reason we go triple EM over the standard attack, animo damage, and crit build is not only because triple EM buffs our team a ton, but also because the triple EM outdamages the crit setup in pretty much all multi-target situations thanks to how many swirl reactions Kazuha can quickly output. However, if you're in whale territory and have C6, then it really is your discretion on what build you want to go. Whether you opt for the triple EM build, replace the circlet for crit and go double EM, or even completely disregard EM and go the standard DPS build, it all boils down to which build gives your Kazuha the best stats. As for artifact substats, EM and ER are the main focus for Kazuha. If you're running Kazuha as your only animo character, he really needs around 160 to 180% energy recharge to consistently spam his elemental burst. Most players will reach this threshold by weapon stats, but if you can't get enough ER through weapons and artifact substats, remember that you can also run an energy recharge main stat in these sands as I mentioned before. With how easy artifacts are for Kazuha, it's no surprise that most players get stumped on weapons for Kazuha over artifacts. Luckily for you, there are some pretty clear choices that you can turn to when it comes to Kazuha's weapon repertoire. Remember that as a support, Kazuha's weapons are not necessarily ranked by which give him the most damage, but rather which weapons can bolster his support and provide utility to the team. With that being said, the best in slot for Kazuha is obviously going to be his signature weapon, Freedom Sworn. You know how I said weapons are ranked on utility? Well, not only does this weapon provide insane utility, but it's also his best damage option. Normally, most players can only afford to pull for weapons for their main DPS characters, but Kazuha is definitely an exception to that. Freedom Sworn is not a necessity on Kazuha, but trust me when I say this, you won't regret pulling for this weapon. Beyond Freedom Sworn, things get very conditional when it comes to selecting Kazuha's next best options. However, assuming your battles don't end in 2 seconds and you're not one-shotting content, some of the most consistent options for Kazuha are the energy recharge options. The two most common 4-star options are Sacrificial Sword and Favonius Sword. With either of these swords, you barely need to focus energy recharge in artifacts, meaning you can turn your undivided attention to Elemental Mastery. And as a result, these two weapons are right behind Freedom Sword when it comes to strength on Kazuha. The only difference between these two swords is that Sacrificial Sword gives Kazuha some more personal damage with its passive, while Favonius Sword can grant extra energy to your main DPS characters. And moving right along into the number 4 spot, we have the completely free-to-play option, Iron Sting. Theoretically, Iron Sting will outperform Sacrificial Sword and Favonius Sword in damage, but remember that Kazuha's weapons are ranked on utility over damage as a support. So yes, you can put Iron Sting over the energy recharge options when it comes to damage, but most veteran Kazuha players and theory crafters will agree that you should favor the consistency of Favonius Sword and Sacrificial Sword when it comes to rotations and constantly using your elemental burst. After Iron Sting, many other options come into mind like Scoured Blade, Dark Iron Sword, and Amanoa Kage Uchi. All of these options either boost Kazuha's support or provide some sort of energy generation. If you're a C6 Kazuha player, then Primordial Jade Cutter and Mistblade Reforged are also phenomenal options for crit stats. Outside of that, stick to the first 4 options that I mentioned in the rankings because they are by far the most consistent. Okay, I know what you're thinking. Kazuha can be on a billion teams and this section of the video could take 10 years. Since I already spent a ton of time explaining the misconceptions of Kazuha, I'm going to try to keep this section short. In the end, pretty much every elemental damage dealer outside of Geo characters can benefit from Kazuha, and you shouldn't be afraid to use him everywhere. Instead, this section will introduce a few teams where the setup heavily relies on Kazuha's support over any ordinary animo support. The first team that relies on Kazuha is the Ganyu Melt team. Normally, this team consists of Ganyu, Bennett, Xiangling, and Diona, however, with this new version, we replace Xiangling with Kazuha. In the old Ganyu Melt team, Xiangling required a ton of energy recharge and forced Ganyu to stay close to the enemy in order for Xiangling's Pyronado to hit enemies and set up the melt reaction. Kazuha as a replacement remedies both of these issues. First, his energy problem is much less drastic as Xiangling's, and second, his elemental burst has a wide AoE, allowing Ganyu to play from safer distances without missing out on melt reactions. Our second team of this section is the Electro Hypercarry team. Kazuha has single-handedly propelled electro carries into the spotlight, with the most popular being Raiden Shogun by a long shot. This team consists of Raiden, Kazuha, Bennett, and Kujo Sara, but if you don't have Raiden, other electro hyper carries include Yai Miko, Cushing, and even Beidou. The goal of the team is obviously to surround our electro character with 3 supports and mow down enemies in short bursts of damage. While other Anemo supports can work for the Viridescent Veneer debuff, Sucrose's Elemental Mastery buff has no bearing on raw electro damage, which makes Kazuha a step ahead of the rest of the Anemo cast. The last team I want to talk about is a Freeze team, which is a general archetype. Like the Electro Hyper Carry team, the same exact predicament stands where Sucrose's Elemental Mastery buff is useless with Freeze. As a result, Kazuha also becomes a backbone of many Freeze teams. And if you're tired of pairing Bennett with Kazuha because of their interaction, this is the perfect team where you get to step away from that. A Freeze team normally consists of a Cryo DPS, a Cryo Support, a Hydro Application, and Kazuha in the last slot. An example team can be Ayaka, Xingqiu, Diona, and Kazuha. In the early days of Genshin, Freeze teams weren't really explored too much, but now they are some of the strongest teams to clear content with. Personally, Freeze teams are some of my favorite teams, and they also give me some of my fastest clear times in Spiral Abyss, so definitely take advantage of Kazuha's powerful support with Freeze. There's only a small portion of people who I've spoken to that aren't pulling for Kazuha and still don't have him, so here's a huge good luck to everyone planning to pull for Kazuha on his rerun. Trust me when I say this, he's going to make your game so much easier. But besides that, if you enjoyed this guide or thought it was useful, be sure to support both the video and the channel. You can follow me on Twitch, join my Discord, sub to the YouTube channel, or whatever people do nowadays. Other than that, it's the same as always. I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.